Hey, this is Artie Astor. Welcome to my channel. I just had to make a video this morning. I saw this YouTube short with Gene Simmons, the lead singer of Kiss, and I was blown away with how fast and strong I disagreed with just about everything he said. Although I understand his point of view, I understand why he's saying what he's saying, but the facts don't add up. If I was in debate class, I would say he's inserting a meaning to something. He's taking facts and then inserting context that necessarily isn't there. So let's just watch, and I'll tell you why I disagree so much. Why did I do that? Get over here. I don't want you over there. Okay, ready? Let's go back. So Gene Simmons says rock is dead. Let's listen.
Yeah, rock is dead, and I'll prove it to you. You ready?
Yeah, go on then.
1958 until 1988 is 30 years. We had Elvis, the Beatles, the Stones, and Pink Floyd, and God knows, 1,000 British invasion bands, a few American bands, and you had the heavy bands, Maiden and Metallica and so on, U2, Bowie, Prince, on and on and on. Madonna, and the disco stuff, Motown, really rich music. From 1988 until today is more than 30 years. Where are the Beatles? Where's Elvis? Who's the new Beatles? Yeah, rock is dead, and I'll prove it to you.
Okay, so he's taken apples and oranges here. So from 1958 to 1988. So in the 50s, so this is what, you have, and I don't have a degree in music. I just study it for fun. And I did do a little touch-up research before I made this video because I wanted to make sure I got my years correct. So like you had like Bo Diddley in like 54, Chuck Berry, I think like mid 50s, like 55, 56, and of course you had Elvis. And then, by the early 60s, then you had the beginning of this like British invasion, which I would say started with the Beatles and then the Stones. And then you had all these other British bands come over. And then in the late 60s, Led Zeppelin came over. And then from the early 70s, forget it. Rock and roll was everywhere in the world, not just here in the United States. And we really can thank, the UK for that, because they took what was being created as rock and roll, and they came over and they were like, hey, this is the Americas really needed to make it big with rock and roll, and all these British bands came over, and it was just lights out after that. No one could stand 3 minutes in the ring with rock and roll at that point. But it stems from jazz and blues. Now this is the way I look at it, and I've played jazz, I've played blues, I've played rock, and rock is the most freely expressive form of music in that sense. And people will disagree with me, and they'll say no, it's blues, and they'll say no, it's jazz. I get it, it's subjective, but let me talk some facts, okay? Facts. Jazz uses chord voicings that are not basic. Many would say that they're actually complex chord voicings, and it's very rare to see a jazz song with two chords, or three, or one, which some rock songs do. They just vary up the voicings. Blues is a lot simpler than jazz, but it's a very tight template. 12 bars usually revolves around the one chord, the four chord, and the five chord in a specific order, and that's it. If you want to veer off, you might get a flat six and a flat seven chord in there. Who knows? The blues can be complex, but it's mostly, in my opinion, when I play it, it's more expression. How are you expressing yourself? It's what are you doing within that template. Rock and roll is the best of all worlds. It is freely expressive. You can express yourself and improvise like you can with jazz and blues, but you don't have to stick to a tight template like you do with blues. It doesn't have to be 12 bars. It doesn't have to be just the 1, 4, and 5. You can add the 6 and the 2 and all that. You know what I'm saying? So rock and roll is a freer sense of expression. And when it came onto the scene, and it really became popular in the 50s and the late 50s and the early 60s, and then as the 60s went on, it was it. Rock and roll was it. That was it. And it's funny because Gene here mentions Madonna and Prince, who I don't even consider rock. Madonna's pop, Prince is like funk, you know? which came later. So, I mean, yes, rock and roll was huge when it came out, but it was huge because it was new. And it was so new and so free and so different that everyone got into it. Even people who said, "Oh, I want to be a jazz player." Look at the guitar player. What's his name? Robbie Krieger for the Doors. He started off, I think, either playing jazz or classical guitar, but then switched to rock and roll. Why? Because he wanted to make it big. Why? Because he did. He wanted fame and fortune. So he switched to rock and roll because that's what everyone was listening to. And there were a ton of musicians back then who said, okay, I have a background in jazz, I have a background here, I got a background in classical, but they switched over to rock and roll because, you know what? That was a way that they could assure that they would put food on the table. Rock and roll was like the most popular form of music back then. It was new and it was, a big fish in a small pond. Now you have with pop music and funk, R&B. You have the explosion of all the subgenres of country. You have traditional country and all of its subgenres. I didn't even mention the most popular form of music right now, which is hip hop. So rock and roll is not just like one genre in the middle of four. It's one genre in the middle of 20, and they all have subgenres. So it's just so diluted right now. And the most popular instruments in music for the past couple of decades have been drums and bass. What genre of music throws drums and bass in your face right now? Hip hop. And it's easy to put out hip hop music. Sorry, I'm not knocking the genre, but you have the same beat for every song. Or it's just some variation of it, and then you have someone rapping and semi-singing with loads of auto-tune lyrics that are just ridiculously simplistic. Look at what Gene Simmons said. He said that, well, can I fast forward to it?
Cool stuff, Motown, really rich music from 1988 until today is more than 30
This is
years.
after 2018.
Where are the Beatles? Where's Elvis? Who's the new Beatles?
You're not going to get a new Beatles. You can't. It's impossible. Think about it. Those for the Beagles, the Beagles, the Beatles came onto the scene in what, 64, 63? So before then, you had, Bo Diddley, you had Chuck Berry, you had Elvis Presley, you had all these people coming onto the rock scene, and then rock and roll was really starting to grow. And now you have the Beatles come over and they said, look, we're going to do rock, but we're going to write songs that are 2 minutes and 20 seconds long, and they're going to be pop songs, and they're going to be good, they're going to be expressive, but we're going to make them so that everyone follows it. It's not going to be as in your face. And it became popular. It became the most popular form of music, and it was only one out of four. How many genres were there back then? Jazz and blues, Motown in the late 50s started. There was music back then. I mean, classical has been around for centuries. When did rhythm and blues start? Let me Google it. Oh, I'll do it right here. When did rhythm and blues music start? When did R&B? I can't type. Music start. Rhythm and blues, frequently abbreviated R&B, is a genre of popular music that originated from African communities in the 1940s. I didn't know that. I don't know how popular it was back then because you don't really hear about it. When did soul music start? It just has to be 30s or 40s. 50s, soul. And I'm just getting the first answer from Google. 1950s to the 60s. Some view soul as merely a new term for rhythm and blues. So did rhythm and blues turn into soul? When did funk start? I'm going to say 70s. 1960s, mid 60s, funk. Okay, when did disco start? 70s. So what we, from what I can see here, and then of course we know new wave was the 80s, right? When did new wave music start? Late 70s, early 80s. When did let's just do something fun and different. Okay, how about this? When did Um, oh, what's the alt rock start? 79 to 81. When did alternative music start? So okay, so they're doing a lot of people put alternative rock and alternative music in the same category. I actually think this is just what I think, that alternative rock is what came in the 80s after the rock scene kind of changed. And now you have this alternative rock. You have, like new wave, where it kind of was also rock and roll, but it was a different form of rock and roll. And then you just have alternative music, which I always think happened in the 90s, with like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and what have you. What started alternative music? See, they're saying the Velvet Underground in 1967. I mean, I can go on and just look at things. I don't want to make this video too long. I'm going to cut it short. But what you had was a lot of music that essentially was coming from African roots. You had jazz, which came, the funny thing is, and I've researched this before, a little bit deeper than the research I just did. Blues started first, like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And a lot of people were singing, and it really had to do with like, even into the 1800s, it had to do with slave trade and people singing while they were working, and it was just a way for them to just kind of get their mind off of the fact that they were being oppressed. And then that form of music kind of revolved around a 1/4, 1/4/5 type of progression in their voice. And then jazz came after that. And then from jazz, blues came back, but a little bit more polished. And then what did we just research? And I just discovered this now. And the years might be off because it was just the first answer that came from Google. But soul and R&B is from the 40s and 50s, right? Again, African American roots. And then you have rock and roll, this free expression that just exploded onto the scene in the 50s and 60s. And it was the most popular form of music in a small pond. Now we have a lot more genres. We have a lot more genres. Is rock dead? No. It's just hiding behind all these other genres. And yeah, a lot of people don't want to pick up a guitar, And let me say one thing before I end this video. I predict in the next 10 years that, and take it for what you will, hip hop is going to find itself in trouble. I think hip hop right now has been wildly successful. And I mean, I love, and 90s hip hop is like, to me, was a revolution of like, wow, this is some really, and to me, hip hop was so popular in the 90s because it was like rock and roll. It was new, it was different, and it was creative. Hip hop now is tricking its listeners, and it's going to get to a point where the listeners stop and say, you know what? I'm sick of this beat. Because hip hop basically has a variations of 5 different beats, and then they put subpar lyrics over it and then sell it for $10 million. And I think at some point, the average listener, even here in America, we're living paycheck to paycheck. We're working hard. We're hardly able to put food on the table. I hurt my knee. I went to get an MRI and I had to pay a $500 deductible. Now I don't know if I can get that oil change on my car. Now, this is the reality of most Americans, right? And then you have someone doing hip hop and they throw out the same backbeat and they just say some superficial lyrics that just don't connect with anybody, who's an average human in America. And they're going to lose touch with their fan base, and their fan base is going to figure out that they've been duped. And I do think that hip hop today is duping people. It's taken the same beats, the same variations of beats, and just rapping over it and then packaging it up and putting it out there and making bank. And I think there's going to be a time that people are just, this is getting old. This sounds old. And I think it's in the next 5 to 10 years, hip hop is going to be on the decline. It is already on the decline. Interestingly, rock and roll is on the incline right now. Rock and roll is actually gaining popularity, whereas, believe it or not, hip hop is losing a little bit of popularity. And I think people are catching on. It's just we want more creativity in hip hop. Go back to the 90s where you actually had to do things that were different and creative. And I think that hip hop will be okay. But if it keeps doing what it's doing now, it's going to disappear or just be as unpopular as rock and roll is today. Anyways, this is Artie Astor. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button. Enjoy the rest of the day.